What's up, guys? Today, this might honestly be one of the simplest reviews that I've done to date. This is the new Joola Perseus Pro 4, but I think a more appropriate name would probably be the Joola 3S S, because the upgrades are pretty minor and there's a lot of overlap in how they play. So let's talk about it. As always, a quick disclosure, Joola did send us these paddles for free to review, but no review was guaranteed. They did not pay for the video, they did not get to preview this video, and all thoughts are my own. We do have affiliate links down in the description that help support this channel if you use them, but it comes at no extra cost to you, and it helps us keep putting out reviews just like this. First, let's go over what has changed in the Pro 4 when compared to the 3S or the mod. Just like the 3S, the Pro 4 does not have an intentionally core-crushed core from the factory like the mod did. They're using properly sized cores in the mold, so these will have noticeably less power than a mod and shouldn't have the same controversy that the mod had as well. Second, the grip sizes are proper this time. So last year, the 16mm models had thicker grips that were around 4.4 inches in circumference, and now the 16mm models are a proper 4.25 inches, and the 14mm are 4.125 inches. So if you do have smaller hands, you may want to consider the 14mm, since that's the only version that offers a thinner grip. Third, Joola is introducing what they are calling Tech Flex Power, or TFP for short, in addition to the propulsion core, which is the dual layer foam. The simple gist is that they took out an area of the core at the throat and replaced it with a filler material that increases the flexibility of the paddle face. They said the idea behind this was to increase the dwell time, make the paddle feel more forgiving, and enhance ball feel. In terms of internal design changes, this was the big change to the Pro 4 models from the 3S. Now, an interesting thing to note is that even with this filler material, the twist weights actually weren't better on the Pro 4s when compared to our 3S models. Now, looking at our stats and probably other people's, I think there's a chance that our 3Ss were on the heavy end and then our Pro 4 models might be on the low end, so that might be contributing to this issue, but I did find that fascinating because I figured part of putting that material there was going to increase the twist weight, because it did actually end up increasing the static weight just a little bit. It seems that the Pro 4 models, at least for the 16mm, are probably going to range anywhere between 8.1 and 8.3 ounces. Our 16 was about 8.2 ounces. So really, I think that the Tech Flex Power technology in this is really going to just change how the ball feels off the face rather than being a very specific performance enhancement. Though I will say, when compared to a 3S, I did feel like the bottom areas of the paddle felt a little bit better than a 3S, even if the twist weights didn't show it. Fourth, there was also a big emphasis at the event we went to on durability and QC. Throughout Joola's entire history of paddles, there has always been some type of controversy, whether it was grit consistency, snapping at the handle on the original Hyperion, or the core crushing from the original Gen 3 models. They said they've heard the complaints and have put a lot more resources in place into making sure that the paddles are consistent and free of issues. And they also have more people and processes in place to catch issues throughout production. Now, does that mean there will never be an issue? No. That's just manufacturing of any product. Something is bound to slip through that probably shouldn't have. Now, I also love that Joola is telling us that it is a big focus, but they're gonna have to earn that public trust back by actually proving it. Everyone who has these paddles for review only got them 2 weeks ago, so the odds of someone finding issues that quickly probably isn't likely unless they're a really, really heavy hitter. I don't think any of us are going to be able to tell you with any certainty that these are actually more durable than previous models. Now, the other problem I have is that in the time that Gen 2 paddles have existed in the mass market, companies repeatedly say, we've solved core crushing, we found the solution, our paddles don't core crush, they're immune to core crushing. And that has not been true a single time that anyone has said it so far. So I think people really need to manage their expectations with the Pro 4. Well, yes, there's probably a good chance that these are going to be more durable than previous Joola paddles. I don't think it's realistic to expect zero core crushing. Maybe one day a company's finally going to prove me wrong, but I've been told this so many times that I just refuse to believe it until we see paddles that don't do it. But I think with really heavy hitters, paddles are just bound to break at some point. So, long story short, I would still expect that there's going to be core-crushing instances of these paddles. Now, we did cut open our Pro 4 16mm Perseus to see if there was any core compression going on, and I do have to say, I'm impressed. This is one of the healthiest looking cores that I've seen in a while for a thermoformed paddle, so that does lend some credibility to what Joola is saying about improving their processes. If you look on screen now, you can see what a core compressed core looks like in comparison to a healthy core, and there's a big difference, and you can see all of the different waves and squiggly marks on the top core versus the Pro 4 on the bottom. Now, of course, this doesn't mean it's not going to happen on these paddles, but it is good to see that at least on this unit, things were looking great. So that's a good sign, but like I said, there's just going to need to be more time put on these, and my guess is that it's going to be about a month or 2 months before we actually know if the new improvements to these paddles made them more durable or not. And as far as breaking goes, if there is a break-in period, it's more subtle than a lot of paddles because over the time that we've hit these, we haven't really noticed any change. However, normally we have 2 units of each model so we can compare a brand new one to a used one, and we only got sent home with 1 unit. So that has made it harder to notice if there has been a break-in period or not. So I'm going to emphasize this very strongly, and I've had to say this in the last several reviews, but if you're at all worried about durability or there being QC issues, you should just wait. I don't think you get to earn the public trust back just by saying you're working on the issues. You have to actually show people and let them experience it in the wild. So we'll see how it pans out. But anyways, those are the only changes this time around. It's a very subtle and minor update for this year's line of paddles, which I gotta say, I'm really not that surprised by that. When you think about it, the 3S last year and even today is one of the most popular power paddles in the pro game, and I would even argue amongst a lot of amateurs. So if you could basically take the 3S and make it more durable and with a better sweet spot, what more do you really need from it? On another quick side note, for this initial launch, Joola is only releasing the Perseus and new Agassi shape, so if you were hoping for information about the Scorpius, Magnus, or Hyperion, you aren't going to find any information about those right now, and those will launch later in April. Another important thing we have to talk about is that the Pro 4s now have dual certification, and there's going to be 2 versions of them. So at the time of this video, when it launches, the dual certified version is going to be the only one you can buy. That's for USAP and UPA-A tournaments. However, in Q2, they're going to launch a UPA-A only approved version, and the only difference between those 2 models is that the UPA-A version will have more grit on it. This is because USAP is more strict about the grit tolerances that they have, so in order for it to be dual certified, they had to make a version with less grit. It seems at this time, UPA-A is less strict about grit, so they have a version for their pros that have more grit on them. And I know this is going to be confusing, and this is the unfortunate part of having 2 governing bodies in the sport right now. There's going to be 2 sets of rules that companies have to make paddles for. And in cases like this, where one tour allows them to go higher in specification, then they're going to do that so that their players can take full advantage of the regulations that that tour allows. It's really unfortunate, but if you want to keep it simple, if you're an amateur, the version that you want is the dual certified version with a USAP stamp on it. If you're a pro that only plays PPA tournaments, then you're fine with the UPA-A only version. Also, a quick note on the spin. So these dual certification versions do have smoother grit. I haven't played with a UPA-A only version, so I don't really know how much grittier those actually are. The numbers on these paddles were fine. They were in the low to mid 2000s, which is certainly solid, but I wouldn't say that this was the most mind-blowing standout spin paddle that I've ever played. In fact, I would put it amongst pretty much all of the other raw carbon fiber paddles out there, so I wouldn't get your hopes up for something that's going to be super gritty like the Gen 3s, and I'd probably even put something like a carbon true foam above the Perseus Pro 4. All right, now that we've got all of that information out of the way, let's talk about the performance of the paddles. If you've played with a 3S, you will basically already know if you will love or hate the new Pro 4. If you didn't like the 3S, this Pro 4 is unlikely to make you want to consider purchasing one. But if you really enjoyed the 3S, then I think the Pro 4 is a no-brainer now that it has dual certification. I think one of the things people will notice is that it doesn't hit quite as hard as the 3S though, particularly if you've been using a 3S for quite some time and broken it in. The Pro 4 is slightly toned down. We aren't talking about a lot. I would still call the Pro 4 a power paddle, but when hitting side by side with a 3S, the 3S felt like it had more of a spring or trampoline effect in the face, and drives just felt a little bit faster, and the pop at the kitchen seemed to be a little bit more. The way I would describe the feeling of the Pro 4 is more dense than the 3S as well. The face just feels a bit more solid than it did with the 3S. Just like with the Gen 3 and the 3S models, I actually gravitated more towards the 14mm model than I did the 16mm. I think the 14mm feeling stiffer and having less dwell time is what contributed to this. On the 16mm, I always felt like I was having to second guess how hard to hit a reset, or if I might accidentally overswing and hit the ball long. The 16mm feels like the ball dwells on the face a lot longer, so maybe that's part of why the 14mm feels more predictable to me. The 16mm with the ball pocketing feels softer and more pleasant, while the 14mm feels a bit more stiff and harsh. I just found it easier to play because of that feeling. But if I was picking which one I liked purely based on how the ball feels when I hit it, it would be the 16mm. I just didn't play nearly as well with it. If you liked the 16mm previously on the 3S, then you're probably still going to lean towards the 16mm with the Pro 4 and vice versa for the 14mm. When it came to hand speed, I also enjoyed that the 14mm was quicker to swing in the hand. Since our unit was a 113 swing weight, I felt like I had plenty of room to customize the paddle and still not go overboard in terms of swing weight. While the 16mm was only 118, that isn't really that high. I just found it slower to use when compared to the 14mm. The 16mm isn't a slow paddle by any means. It's just when put next to the 14mm, you'll definitely notice a difference. Also, while we're talking about swing weights, they did get a nice little drop from the 3S models. The 16mm still around the same. It's probably going to be about 117 to 121 swing weight on average, but the 14mm that I had from our old 3S actually dropped quite a bit. Our 14mm 3S Perseus had a swing weight of 119, and our 14mm for the Pro 4 is 113. So if they are consistently lighter, that's a nice feature to see. As you can usually expect with a 16mm and 14mm, the 16mm felt like I could drive the ball harder, but when I was at the kitchen line, the 14mm felt poppier and that I could be more aggressive at the net with it. Overall, these paddles are still very aggressive power paddles, just like they were before. These are probably still at the top of the list when it comes to raw power that's still legal at the moment, and I'm sure you're going to see the 5.0 and qualifier brackets of tournaments completely flooded with the Pro 4 models. While I enjoyed playing with them, I don't think that they would be my first choice to take to a tournament. I actually played one this weekend with the Pro 4 14mm, and while I think it was mostly fine, I could tell that when I was under pressure, certain dinks and resets were harder to pull off. On top of that, for easier balls, I just became more aware that I might sail the ball long if I swing too hard, which made me second guess how hard I should swing on a counter or drive. Finding a paddle that you can play confident with and not be aware of is the goal everyone should strive for. And for me, I was just thinking about the paddle too much while playing in a tournament. All right, not that I probably need to say this, since I'm sure everyone watching this video is aware that these are power paddles, but if you struggle with pop-ups at the net or just the soft game in general with power paddles, you're not going to want to buy one of these. These are at the absolute top of what is legal for pop and power right now. So it should go without saying that these are not going to be easy paddles to use. Now, as far as sweet spot goes, with the new TechFlex power in place, the paddle does feel more stable, even if the twist weight numbers aren't drastically different than they were before. Hitting lower on the paddle doesn't feel as jarring as it used to on the 3S. I'm not going to claim that this is an oversized sweet spot, but for a power paddle, it's more than acceptable and better than a lot of power paddles on the market. Historically, when choosing a power paddle, you usually give up some sweet spot, and I find that these strike a good balance between still having a respectable sweet spot and a lot of power. And when comparing the sweet spots between the 16mm and the 14mm Perseus, these 16mm are definitely more stable, and I think more people are going to have an easier time using those. The 14mm, you definitely have to be a little bit more precise or add more weight. So the 14mm are probably going to be for slightly more advanced players, and the 16mm will be a little bit more forgiving, but that's pretty standard with how most paddles go these days. Now let's talk about the new Agassi shape. I'm not going to lie, the first time I saw this thing, I fully expected to hate this shape. I think the shape visually just looks ugly. Every time I see it, all I can think of is a canoe oar. But as we know, looks aren't everything, and I'm glad I gave it a fair shot because I actually preferred it over the 16mm Perseus by a good amount. And just for clarity, the Agassi Pro has all the same features that the other Pro 4 models have. It's just a different shape and nothing else. You can see right here when held side by side with a Perseus that they really don't look that different. It's honestly kind of amazing how rounding a few corners can make a paddle look so different visually or even just less appealing. Now, as far as how it plays, it's obviously similar to how the 16mm Perseus plays, but weirdly I felt like I had a lot more control and the paddle played more predictable. I'm not sure exactly what's contributing to this though. Maybe it's something to do with the shape as a whole, but considering they're both elongated, I'm not sure it would make that big of a difference. And when playing them side by side, even though the swing weights are very similar, it's only 117 versus 118, the Agassi felt noticeably easier to swing on the court. And during my playtest with the Agassi, I didn't even know what the swing weight or balance on it were. When I finally went and ran the stats, I actually thought the swing weight was going to be considerably lower with how much easier it felt to swing. So perhaps some of that power has to do with the balance point. I'm not entirely sure. But every time I went and compared the Agassi Pro to the Perseus 16mm, I felt like I had a much easier time resetting and taking large swings on the ball. On the Perseus, it just felt like I couldn't completely predict what the paddle was going to do, whereas on the Agassi, I just didn't notice that issue. I think they have similar identities in terms of how they feel, but to me, the Agassi felt toned down very slightly in terms of pop and power from the Perseus, which put the paddle in a play style that I really enjoy. Personally, I find the Perseus 16mm a bit too much for me to play with. So I wouldn't sleep on the Agassi shape, particularly if you haven't been a huge fan of the Perseus in the past. If you can find a place to demo it, I would highly recommend that you give it a chance. Also, just to be clear, we never received a 14mm Agassi, so I can't give you any thoughts on how that plays. Now, as far as weight setups go, I did end up customizing the 16mm Agassi and the Perseus 14mm, both with the same setup. I used 1 gram per inch tungsten tape, and I used about a 5 to 6 inch strip starting at the throat and then going up. I didn't feel like these paddles needed any more power, and I wanted to keep the swing weight lower, so that was my reasoning for starting so low on the paddle with this weight setup. I did find that it achieved what I wanted, which was just adding a bit more solidity to the paddle, especially on resets. So if you are just trying to enhance the paddle a little bit, this is probably the setup that I would recommend. If you're not concerned about the swing weight going up or you want the paddle to hit even harder, then placing it at 3 and 9 or even higher would obviously achieve that for you. As far as the 16mm Perseus goes, I didn't feel like it needed the weight, and it was already a bit heavier, so I didn't end up modifying that one at all. Now that you know how the Pro 4s play, let's compare the Perseus models to some other popular power paddles that you might be considering purchasing. We'll start with the mod. Since a lot of you have the refresh program from the mod being delisted, if you are hoping it will have as much power as a mod, it just won't. Since the mods were intentionally core crushed at the factory, you're just not going to be able to match that type of power. If you were hoping for a paddle that still packs a good punch, but gives you more control than a mod, then the Pro 4 models will do that very well, but it'll do it well in a similar way that the 3S already did. So if you're a mod user, it's important to set your expectations properly that you just aren't going to be able to find paddles that hit quite that hard anymore, especially with the new regulations that are in place. Now for the 11624 Power Series, the Pro 4 definitely hits harder. I find that the consistency and ease of use is better on the 11624s though. They have a stiffer feel in comparison, and you basically know what you're going to get no matter how you swing at the ball. Whereas on the Pro 4s, sometimes you may question how hard you should hit the ball, or it's just not as obvious what the paddle is going to do. One of the big differences is that the Pro 4 16mm models, you can really feel the ball sink into the face of the paddle, whereas on the Power Series, it's a bit more crisp or stiff. I think the Power Series from 11624 does a great job bringing slightly lower power than the Pro 4, but with a larger sweet spot and at $100 cheaper and probably easier for most amateurs to play with. However, if your objective is to simply max out pop and power, then the Joolas are probably the route that you'd want to go. You're just gonna pay a premium for it. For the PaddleTek Bantams, I think most of you probably know the common advantages and disadvantages by now, but if you need a refresher, the biggest con of the PaddleTek in comparison to the Pro 4 is going to be the sweet spot size. Of all the major power paddles right now, this is the biggest problems that the PaddleTeks suffer. I think it takes a higher level player to take full advantage of the PaddleTeks, where something like the Pro 4s are a little bit easier to use because the sweet spot is larger. If you can't consistently hit the sweet spot, you're not going to get the maximum amount of power out of the PaddleTeks that you can. Otherwise, I think of all the power paddles right now, these are the closest in terms of pop and power to the Pro 4. The Bantams have been known known to be very poppy, and I think I would even give the advantage to the 12.7mm models over the Pro 4 when it comes to pop. The Joolas are still poppy, but I feel like the pop came easier from the PaddleTeks than it did the Pro 4. The PaddleTeks also feel more hollow and in some ways more cheap when you hit, especially the more you get off center, because the change in how the paddle feels from the center out to the edges drops off very quickly. But as always, you have to give PaddleTek huge props because these paddles play very consistently over their life, unlike thermoformed paddles. They pretty much play the same way from when you get the paddle to whenever you're finally going to be done with it. With the PaddleTeks, usually the reason you're going to be replacing them is because of the grit wearing down. So if you don't want to deal with any of that break-in nonsense, then the PaddleTeks are your best bet. Now, the Proton Flamingo is an interesting one to compare since it's using a very similar construction to a 3S, just with a little bit less dual edge foam, and I believe the cell sizes are also slightly smaller on the Flamingo when compared to a 3S. But overall, they're very familiar designs. While we haven't done a full in-depth review on the Flamingo, we have been playtesting ours, and so far we have noticed that it has changed from how it came out of the box. Out of the box, it felt more firm and really not that special or hard-hitting. However, the more we use it, it has started to change and loosen up. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, I'm really not a fan of paddles doing this at all, particularly because I've already seen a number of reports all over the internet about people core crushing their Flamingos. Since nothing was advertised to be more durable or special than other Gen 3s, it doesn't give me a lot of confidence in the design of the Flamingo. So if you do choose to pick up a Flamingo, just proceed at your own risk and know that the durability is still very much in question. However, with that warning out of the way, here's how the paddles actually compare. The Proton has much less of a dwell time feeling and plays stiffer than the 16mm Perseus. I found that it made the paddle easier to play with, and it felt a little bit more consistent for dinks and resets. In a lot of ways, it actually reminds me of how the 11.624 Power series play. The Pro 4s felt like they had more raw power overall, so if your goal was pure power, the Joolas are what you would want to choose. If you wanted something with a stiffer feel and a bit easier to use, then I think the Proton Flamingo would be the one you want. So at the end of the day, a big part of this specific comparison is going to come down to how durable the Joolas actually end up being. If they do hold up with far less core crushing than previously, then I would choose the Pro 4 over the Series 3 all day. But until we see more units in the wild, we just won't know if that's true. You shouldn't be spending nearly $300 and having durability or consistency be an issue. All right, so to wrap this thing up, I think it's about what you guys can expect. It's one of the best pure power paddles you can buy in pickleball right now, and I don't think that's going to be a shocker to anyone considering how popular the 3S was. I guess the thing I'd like to reiterate is that nobody knows how durable these are yet. If you've got money to blow or you're part of the Joola refresh program from the mod, then sure, get the Perseus Pro 4 and you'll probably enjoy it. But I think for everyone else, your best bet is going to be able to hold off and wait to see what happens with the QC and durability. I've just seen this story way too many times in pickleball, and it's going to take a lot more than some statements and a presentation to convince me that all of the break-in and durability issues are gone now. So my recommendation for now is to wait and see what happens. I don't expect that these paddles will never break. I'm sure you're still going to find pros or really heavy hitters who are going to break them. But if what Joola said is true, I expect, or at least hope, to see significantly less of this issue in particular at the amateur level. So I guess the long story short is, if you don't care about waiting to see if these are more durable and want a slightly more solid feeling 3S that's also dual certified right now, this is the paddle you want. It's a minor revision to a paddle that was already highly sought after and made it slightly better in my opinion. But it's not a groundbreaking technological change or going to completely change how the game is played. It's a nice revision that slightly bumps up the performance of the paddle. So yeah, I think Joola's going to have to do a lot to earn the public trust back. I think with all of the QC issues they've had over the years, and then the Gen 3s getting banned, and then the 3S only being UPA-A approved, there's a lot of trust to earn back. People are frustrated, and rightfully so. And I hope that Joola's right about everything they've said, with them taking things more seriously with durability and trying to improve their paddles. I think it would be great to see them become a reputable company in pickleball, but it's going to take a lot of time for people to give that trust back, and it's not going to come easy. So there you guys go. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.